The rain had ceased an hour before dusk, leaving the lawns of Highford House washed to a subdued emerald sheen. Lamps had begun to glow along the gravel drive, their reflections quivering softly in the remaining puddles. Within the great music room, an elongated chamber lined with pale walnut panels and hung with a discreet constellation of modernist portraits, the first guests drifted in with the practiced languor of those accustomed to being welcomed, announced, and admired. It was Lady Helena Cosgrove's annual autumn musicale, ostensibly held to encourage the local arts. In practice, it served as the region's most carefully orchestrated performance of reputation, wealth, and quiet rivalry. The pièce de résistance for this year's program, whispered among guests for weeks, was the long-awaited public rehearsal of a newly commissioned duet for 2 grand pianos, a work composed by the rising musician Adrian Sorrell and performed by Sorrell himself, alongside his longtime colleague, protégé and occasional adversary, Miss Livia Arden. The instrument pair stood at the center of the room like 2 black swans poised for flight. Their lids were raised at identical angles, the polished ebony surfaces gleaming under the chandelier's silvery light. A faint fragrance of cedar and newly waxed wood lingered in the air, complementing the murmuring scent of the guests' perfumes and the soft rustle of silk gowns. Lady Helena, tall, elegant, and as meticulously arranged as one of her own floral displays, greeted her visitors with cool warmth. "My dear, you've braved the roads," she murmured to a retired admiral and his wife. "How good of you. We're expecting a truly singular performance tonight." Her eyes darted, subtly, almost reflexively, toward Adrian Sorrell, who stood a little apart from the gathering. He was a slender man in his early 30s, pale and unsmiling, with the distracted manner of someone rehearsing inwardly, even as he attempted to listen. He nodded occasionally at the remarks of Sir Julian Vance, the critic, though it was evident that Sir Julian's expansive commentary washed over him like rain over stone. Livia Arden entered several minutes later, dressed in a gown of deep blue velvet that emphasized the clarity of her posture, every line elegant, deliberate, proud. Her smile brought an immediate shift in the room's temperature. Conversations brightened, the hush deepened, and heads angled discreetly to observe her progress. She greeted Sorrell with a brief bow of the head, too formal for warmth, too cool for affection. Something between them trembled in the air like an unresolved chord. "You're late," Sorrell murmured, barely audible. "Only fashionably," Livia replied, her tone light but edged. "Besides, the piece waits for no one, not even its composer." Lady Helena advanced upon them with a gracious sweep, urging them toward the pair of pianos with an enthusiasm slightly too pointed to be entirely benign. "Adrian, Livia, do come. We shall begin in a quarter hour. Some of our guests have come a very long way." It was Sir Julian who caught the flicker between the 2 performers. Sorrell's tightening jaw, Livia's narrowing gaze, subtle, almost imperceptible, but suggestive of friction beneath the polished veneer. He filed the observation away with a critic's satisfaction, believing the tension to be artistic, personal, or both. In the far corner, the butler, Mr. Greaves, presided over a silver tray of sherry glasses with the solemn dignity of a cathedral verger. He offered his wares silently, but his eyes were attentive, taking in with mild disapproval the more flamboyant gestures of the guests. When Livia's coat slipped from her shoulders and onto a nearby chair, Greaves retrieved it with a look that managed to convey reproach without the slightest shift in his expression. A faint tremor of discord rippled through the room as a newcomer entered. A tall man in a dark tailored suit, accompanied by no announcement. He paused briefly at the threshold. His face bore a certain weathered composure, the type acquired not from age but from habitually measuring a room. Only a handful of guests recognized him at once, and their reaction was more startled than delighted. "Good Lord," whispered Sir Julian to Lady Helena. "Is that—" "Yes," she murmured, her voice tightening. Inspector Roderick Alleyn. He's here on holiday, or so he assures me. He is a friend of my brother's." Holiday or not, Alleyn carried his presence like a soft lamp, unobtrusive yet clarifying. He exchanged a courteous bow with Lady Helena and a faintly apologetic smile with the guests who found their conversations suddenly more restrained. Without placing himself at the center, he nonetheless became a point of gravity. "Please don't let me interrupt," he said with sincerity. "I am here purely as an admirer of music." Yet his gaze, calm, intelligent, almost amused, took in the room with the ease of a man accustomed to noticing what others did not. As the guests made their final preparations for the rehearsal, a quiet unease coiled among the polished floors and elegant walls. Something, though none could have named it, had already begun to disturb the symmetry of the evening. Soon the first notes would be struck, and something beneath them would soon crack. The first notes trembled into the hushed room like cautious footsteps on marble. Sorrel's fingers hovered, poised above the keys, while Livia's hands, long and deliberate, traced the surface of her piano as though feeling its mood before sound. The music began softly, a dialogue of shadows and light, its phrasing deliberate, refined, yet carrying an undercurrent of tension that none of the guests could name. Lady Helena, seated at the far end on a delicate chaise, tilted her head as if measuring the harmony. Sir Julian Vance, notebook momentarily abandoned, leaned forward slightly, his pen resting forgotten between his fingers. Even the servants seemed to have suspended themselves into statues of expectation. And then, almost imperceptibly, the flow of the piece faltered. A chord was struck too harshly, sharp, jarring, but brief enough that most could dismiss it as accident. Sorrel's eyes flicked toward Livia, a micro-expression of irritation barely contained. She returned his glance with equal precision, yet without acknowledgement. The room waited, the music continuing, but the subtle discord had already unsettled the invisible equilibrium. It was Mr. Greaves who noticed first, moving toward the door leading to the dressing rooms with his usual quiet efficiency. He returned within moments, his composed face now edged with concern. "Lady Helena, you may wish to see this," he murmured. A hush descended, drawing every guest's gaze toward the small antechamber. Lady Helena rose gracefully, a faint pallor on her cheeks, and followed the butler. The room remained still, the piano's reflections shimmering like black water in the chandelier light. The notes of the duet lingered, unresolved, as if reluctant to continue without the proper witness. They returned almost immediately, Lady Helena's expression contained but firm, and with her, the body of Miss Arden's accompanist, Gerald Maynard, a man of steady habits and discreet charm, now motionless in the soft light of the antechamber. He lay partially slumped on the floor, a small, elegant spill of ink on the sleeve of his jacket from the score he had been marking. The quiet horror was accentuated by its ordinariness. No grand gesture, no scream, only the subtle, impossibly still collapse of a man who had been expected to rise, to perform, to smile. The room absorbed it with an almost tactile restraint. Gasps were carefully contained. A cough, abrupt and nervous, broke the silence. Sorrel stopped mid-gesture, hands hovering over keys that now seemed too large, too polished, too empty. "Mr. Maynard." Lady Helena's voice was calm, though there was an edge of brittle panic beneath. Who could have—" No one answered immediately. The guests exchanged glances, waited with polite alarm, each pretending to occupy the proper distance between curiosity and propriety. The Admiral's wife discreetly lowered her hand to her throat. Sir Julian Vance's notebook clicked shut, the sound unnaturally loud in the suspended room. Alleyn, who had been quietly observing from the periphery, approached with his characteristic measured steps. There was no rush, no alarm in his manner, only a quiet, deliberate assessment of what lay before him. He knelt briefly beside the body, noting the angle of the fallen man, the neatness of his clothing, the absence of any visible wound. "Nothing dramatic," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "A heart, perhaps, or a misstep. We must not presume." His eyes flicked to Lady Helena, who met his gaze with restrained fear. "May I?" he asked softly, and she inclined her head, silent acquiescence in the chaos of civility. He stood, straightened, and surveyed the room with the calm detachment that always carried its own quiet authority. The pianos remained as they were, two silent sentinels awaiting a return that would not come. The guests' murmurs rose slightly, delicate threads of speculation that did not yet demand interruption. In that precise stillness, Alleyn began to see the contours of the evening differently. The subtle friction between Sorel and the deceased, the controlled tension of Livia's posture even in absence, the almost imperceptible anxiety of servants whose composure was never casual. It was, in its way, a room of secrets, illuminated not by light, but by what refused to be spoken. Lady Helena, composed yet tremulous, stepped closer to Alleyn. "Do you think—" He shook his head, his eyes sweeping once more across the polished panels, the glimmering chandeliers, and the elegant array of guests. "I think," he said quietly, "that we must allow the evening to pause and observe. There is more here than meets the eye, and it is rarely violent in the way one expects." The guests murmured, some lowering themselves into chairs, others lingering by the pianos as though seeking a foothold in the ordinary. Outside, the wind rattled against the windows, tapping its own subtle rhythm. Within, a death had occurred, silent and precise, and already the delicate tension of Highford House's autumnal gathering had begun to fracture. The music had ceased, but the story, Alleyn knew, had only just begun. Alleyn remained standing, a figure of deliberate calm amid the ripples of restrained shock. The guests, uncertain how to comport themselves, drifted toward chairs or the distant corners of the room, voices reduced to careful murmurs. Even Lady Helena, who prided herself on composure, seemed momentarily unmoored. He surveyed each face with a quiet thoroughness. Sorrel, still hovering near his piano, had folded his hands in front of him, posture taut, shoulders slightly hunched. His pale eyes betrayed a tension not entirely due to grief or surprise. There was calculation there, a subtle awareness of being measured. Livia Arden's absence from the main room, she had remained in the antechamber for some minutes longer, was conspicuous in its implication. When she reappeared, she moved with precise control, a mask of serene concern concealing a flicker of internal unrest. Alleyn noted the slight crease of her brow as she observed Sorrel, as if testing, weighing, or measuring him. Sir Julian Vance, emboldened by a critic's curiosity, attempted to initiate a conversation. "Remarkable, isn't it, Inspector?" he said almost cheerfully, "how such a sudden calamity can reshape an entire performance." He leaned slightly forward, pen poised, to resume writing. Alleyn's response was polite, almost conversational, yet there was a gravity beneath it that invited silence. "Yes, and equally remarkable," he said slowly. "How much can be learned by simply observing what is or is not being said." The words seemed to ripple across the room. Guests faltered mid-step, glances darting sideways. Alleyn's reputation, subtle and well-earned, was a presence of its own, a reminder that observation could be more incisive than question or accusation. He moved quietly, letting his eyes linger on minor details others overlooked. The polished shoes of one gentleman bore faint traces of mud from the gravel drive. A woman's hand trembled ever so slightly as she held her fan. Greaves, the butler, maintained an immaculately neutral expression, but the angle of his head suggested he had seen something, perhaps everything, but deemed disclosure premature. These minutiae, seemingly trivial, were in Alleyn's method the architecture of understanding. Approaching the pianos, he allowed his gaze to trace the contours of the instruments. Each was open, gleaming, and yet strangely cold in their silence. The first notes of the piece, though abandoned, lingered in memory. A delicate tension, now rendered hollow by Maynard's absence. He noted a faint smudge of dust near the edge of Sorrel's piano. A small thing, but in its deviation from routine, telling. Small disruptions often preceded larger ones, Alleyn reflected, and in a house as meticulously managed as Highford, such deviations were rarely without significance. Lady Helena approached, speaking in a voice carefully moderated. "Inspector, do you wish to speak with anyone? The guests, I mean. Or shall we allow them to settle?" He considered her carefully, allowing a moment's pause to communicate calm. "Let us observe first," he replied. "People reveal themselves in many ways. Speech is only part of the story." With that, Alleyn turned toward the guests, noting their arrangements. The Admiral and his wife had resumed their seats, though the Admiral's hand rested unconsciously atop a cane, knuckles white. Sir Julian lingered near the doorway, notebook half forgotten, but alert. Others moved with the careful grace expected of their class, yet their eyes betrayed the slightest tremor of curiosity, unease, or concealed guilt. Alleyn allowed a smile, faint and courteous, to touch his lips. Not for amusement, but to remind the room that he was neither intruder nor intruder's agent. He made no questions yet, no challenges. He merely existed among them as an observer, and in his quiet presence, the subtle fractures in decorum became easier to perceive. He noted, in particular, the servants' positions. Greaves standing with hands folded behind his back, the housekeeper just visible near the far sideboard, and a young footman peering discreetly from the doorway to the kitchen. Their restraint was deliberate. They knew more than they would yet reveal. Alleyn filed this away silently. Knowledge, he reminded himself, was often best gathered in patience. Finally, he turned back toward Lady Helena. "There is a rhythm to this household," he said quietly. "A pattern that may in time guide us to understanding. But for now, it is only necessary to watch and wait. The music may be paused, yet the story has begun its own movement." As he spoke, the guests seemed to sense the shift in focus, settling into their positions like actors on a stage, aware that an unseen conductor was marking tempo. And in that subtle adjustment, Alleyn felt the first true pulse of the evening, the undercurrent of motive, rivalry, and restraint, flowing quietly beneath the elegant surface. Highford House, resplendent yet subtly taut, awaited its next note. Alleyn began his quiet perambulation among the guests, adopting a manner at once unobtrusive and insistent in its subtlety. He spoke first to the Admiral and his wife, whose expressions suggested the fragile balance between curiosity and etiquette. "My dear Admiral, how well you managed to conceal concern," Alleyn observed, his voice low and courteous. "Yet one suspects that even the most disciplined nerves reveal themselves in the smallest gestures." The Admiral inclined his head, lips pressed thin. "Indeed, Inspector, though I confess, it is difficult not to notice. Irregularities, shall we say. There was something odd in Mr. Maynard's manner earlier. He seemed distracted." Alleyn nodded, noting the cautious phrasing. Distraction, he knew, often signified more than casual absence of thought. He allowed the Admiral's words to settle, offering no immediate comment. Politeness, in such circumstances, was often the key to drawing truth. Next, he approached Sir Julian Vance, whose eyes glittered with restrained excitement. "Sir Julian, I imagine a critic's instincts are always alert," Alleyn said. "Do you find the room unusually tense?" Sir Julian's smile was thin, almost perfunctory. "One might call it that, Inspector. Yet tension is, perhaps, a requirement of good art. Even the smallest pause in a performance can produce the most profound reaction. Alleyn inclined his head, allowing the statement to hang. He had heard this same sentiment expressed in countless variations by musicians, actors, and patrons alike. Words could be performed as well as music, and the subtle deception in Sir Julian's tone was not lost on him. He then turned to Mrs. Vance, who, unlike her husband, seemed genuinely uneasy. Her fingers toyed with the edge of her lace cuff, betraying a nervous energy that contrasted with the rigid calm she attempted to present. Did Mr. Maynard seem concerned about anything unusual in the days preceding this evening? Alleyn asked, deliberately indirect, allowing observation to precede disclosure. Mrs. Vance's brow furrowed. Not that I can say, except perhaps in his interactions with Miss Arden. There was something unspoken between them. Not conflict exactly, but a tension. One might call it rivalry, though he would never have acknowledged it. Alleyn's eyes flicked toward the far corner of the room, where Livia now stood with her back partially turned, observing Sorrel with the faintest trace of measurement. He noted the delicate balance in her posture, relaxed yet deliberately controlled, her hands lightly clasped in front, her fingers betraying barely perceptible tightening. He moved closer to the group surrounding the pianos, where Sorrel stood rigid, pale and attentive to no one in particular. "Mr. Sorrel," he said quietly, "your colleague was a remarkable musician. Did you notice any subtle change in his behavior recently? Anything at all that seemed out of the ordinary?" Sorrel's gaze, steady yet guarded, met Alleyn's. "Out of the ordinary," he repeated, voice measured. He was meticulous, as always, careful, focused, but yes, perhaps there was a slight hesitation in his work. Nothing more. Alleyn allowed a pause, letting the silence emphasize the evasion. It was not uncommon for the nearest associates to obscure facts, not out of malice, but out of instinctive loyalty or fear of impropriety. Observation, he reminded himself, was more revealing than direct inquiry. Livia, having noticed the approach, stepped forward with a carefully neutral expression. "Inspector, are you questioning everyone?" Her voice was polite, almost rehearsed, with an edge of challenge that was imperceptible to most. "Merely speaking with those who were present," Alleyn replied, maintaining a courteous distance. "One hopes to understand not only what has occurred, but the circumstances that might have permitted it." Her lips pressed lightly together, eyes briefly glancing toward Sorrel. "Circumstances are often misleading, Inspector. One can rarely judge by appearances alone." Alleyn inclined his head subtly. "Quite so. And yet appearances, when considered in aggregate, often conceal more than they reveal. One observes not only the spoken word, but the choice to remain silent." As he moved on, Alleyn's attention shifted to the servants, noting their posture, positions, and the precise modulation of their expressions. Each contained a story they were unwilling to share openly. In Alleyn's experience, the silent knowledge of those who served quietly was often as revealing as the declarations of those who led. The room, elegant and controlled, seemed to hum with restrained observation. Every conversation was a performance, every evasion a small disclosure. Alleyn, quiet and patient, collected these fragments, knowing the truth would reveal itself, not in spectacle or confession, but in the imperceptible fractures of human behavior. And in those fractures, the first contours of motive were already beginning to emerge. Alleyn's gaze drifted toward the corners of the music room, where the servants lingered with disciplined patience. Greaves, the butler, remained immovable near the sideboard, hands folded precisely behind his back. The housekeeper, Mrs. Cranley, observed the unfolding tension with careful restraint, her eyes briefly meeting Alleyn's and withdrawing as if nothing had occurred. Even the footman at the doorway exhibited a measured composure that betrayed awareness without the faintest admission. Alleyn approached Greaves, voice soft yet precise. "Mr. Greaves, you have overseen many such gatherings. Has anything struck you as out of the ordinary this evening?" The butler's posture did not falter. He inclined his head slightly, expression neutral. "Out of the ordinary, sir," he replied. "I have merely attended to my duties. Guests are guests, and instruments are instruments." Alleyn allowed a faint, courteous smile. "Indeed. Yet you have observed the manner in which the guests relate to one another. Certain tensions, perhaps, or frictions?" A subtle shadow crossed Greaves's otherwise impassive features. "People may display frictions of many kinds, Inspector. I would not presume to interpret them." "Of course," Alleyn said, lowering his voice. "I seek not interpretation, merely observation. One notes facts, and the facts often speak more than words." For a moment, the butler's eyes lingered on him, assessing the purpose of the question. Then, as if the decision had been weighed and dismissed, he inclined his head again. "Very well, sir. I've noticed that Mr. Maynard, in his daily routine, always adjusted the music stand in the same precise manner before beginning practice. This evening it remained slightly askew. I thought little of it at the time, but..." His voice faded, and the implication hung unsaid. Alleyn nodded, filing the observation silently. Small details, he knew, often carried weight far beyond their apparent significance. A deviation from habit could mark tension, distraction, or intention, often a whisper of a truth that would not speak itself aloud. Mrs. Cranley approached next, her hands folded over the cloth of her apron, eyes fixed with polite neutrality. Alleyn addressed her with the same calm courtesy he extended to all. "Mrs. Cranley, did you notice anything unusual in Mr. Maynard's behavior today?" She hesitated, as though weighing the propriety of disclosure. "Only that he appeared preoccupied, sir. There was a letter he brought this morning addressed to Miss Arden. He read it quickly and then set it aside. He did not speak of it. I did not ask, nor did I presume." Alleyn inclined his head, noting the subtle admission. Letters, in households of such refinement, often carried more than words. They were instruments of influence, discretion, and sometimes mischief. The care with which she had withheld and revealed the information suggested a delicate balancing act of loyalty and honesty. He turned briefly to the footman who lingered at the doorway. The boy's wide eyes had flickered with something Alleyn recognized instantly. Fear mixed with understanding, the dual knowledge of witness and silence. "And you, young man," he said quietly, "have you observed anything unusual?" The footman swallowed, glanced at Greaves and Mrs. Cranley, then lowered his eyes. Only that Mr. Maynard seemed uneasy when Miss Arden approached the practice room. And when she left, he adjusted the piano bench several times, as if to correct something, but I do not know why, sir." Alleyn's attention sharpened imperceptibly. Habits, routines, and their deviations were often far more telling than declarations. The smallest gestures, unnoticed by the untrained eye, could betray intention or concealment. He stepped back, allowing the servants to return to their positions. No one else spoke of what they had seen. Alleyn, patient and courteous, did not press. Silence, he knew, could be more revealing than questioning. The subtle dislocations of behavior, the glances averted, the hands that trembled ever so slightly, all were elements of a story yet to be fully told. Lady Helena, noticing his brief attention to the staff, approached once more. "Inspector, do you find that the household itself offers clues?" she asked, voice measured. Alleyn's eyes remained on the servants for a moment longer before he answered. "Indeed. One must learn to observe not only what is present, Lady Helena, but what is withheld. In houses such as this, as in people, the silence often contains more than words ever could." She nodded, uncertain, yet with trust. The servants returned to their stations, composure restored, but the subtle tension lingered. They knew, in their own way, that Alleyn had seen beyond what polite eyes allowed. The household itself, in its quiet precision, had begun to reveal fragments of a truth, whispered in gestures, routines, and the careful maintenance of appearances. And Alleyn, patient and attentive, collected each fragment as if assembling a score only he could yet interpret. Alleyn returned his attention to the pianos, lingering at a distance that allowed both observation and discretion. The instruments, polished to perfection, seemed almost impervious to the disturbances of the evening, yet he perceived subtle signs that something had been amiss. A faint scuff mark on the leg of Sorrel's piano, a slight misalignment of pedals, the whisper of dust displaced along the bench's edge. These were details invisible to the untrained eye, but resonant with significance to one attuned to habitual order. He crouched slightly to inspect Sorrel's piano, noting the position of the music stand, now slightly tilted. A small scrap of paper protruded from the score, evidently overlooked in the earlier flurry. Alleyn picked it up delicately, examining the scribbled notations. The handwriting was Maynard's, precise, elegant, and disciplined. Yet there was one anomaly, a single chord marked in a manner inconsistent with the rest of the composition. It was as though Maynard had intended to leave a signal, a note of caution, or a subtle warning. Alleyn's mind traced the habitual actions of the deceased. Maynard had been meticulous, orderly, almost obsessively so, yet here, in his own familiar ritual, a deviation had occurred. Such breaks in routine, Alleyn reflected, were rarely accidental. They spoke of tension, anticipation, or, most dangerously, intentional misdirection. He rose and moved toward Livia's piano, glancing at the bench. It, too, bore the faint marks of adjustment, though executed with her characteristic precision. Yet he noted something odd, a slight indentation on the right-hand side, as if a hand had pressed firmly and lingered, a gesture absent from rehearsals and inconsistent with her usual habits. Alleyn allowed himself a quiet, inward smile. Habitual gestures, after all, were as revealing as words, and the smallest infraction could illuminate the largest truths. Alleyn's eyes wandered over the scores laid out on a nearby music trolley. One of them, annotated by Maynard in his careful, looping script, contained a marginal note that had not been part of the original composition. Ensure clarity of timing. Trust none blindly. Alleyn pondered the phrasing. It was cryptic, yet entirely in character. Maynard, always cautious, never leaving anything to chance, had seemingly foreseen, or feared, a disruption. He shifted his attention to the room's architecture, noting the placement of chairs, the angles of light falling through tall windows, the polished surfaces reflecting fragments of movement. Guests had unconsciously arranged themselves according to social habit, yet the anomaly of positions was revealing. Sorrel remained near the center, restless yet restrained. Lady Helena hovered near the rear, maintaining her authority. Livia, distant yet sharply aware, monitored both her colleague and the audience. The arrangement was a ritual in itself, a choreography of observation and evasion. Alleyn allowed his eyes to rest briefly on Greaves and Mrs. Cranley. Their routines, impeccable yet subtly altered, hinted at the undercurrents of the evening. Greaves had ensured that drinks were served promptly, yet had placed the glasses in slightly different positions, almost imperceptibly disrupting the visual symmetry. A gesture insignificant to all but a discerning observer. Mrs. Cranley, meanwhile, had adjusted a vase on a side table, aligning it not to the room's center, but to catch the edge of the chandelier's reflection. Both actions were minor, yet they suggested a consciousness of observation, a subtle signaling that all was not entirely as it appeared. Alleyn stepped back, taking in the scene as a whole. Music, movement, and ritual intertwined here, each reflecting the personal habits of those who occupied the room. It was in the deviations, The overlooked marks, the misaligned benches, the inscriptions in a familiar hand, that the first hints of intention emerged. He allowed a faint exhalation, almost imperceptible, as if acknowledging the first real fragment of clarity. This was not evidence in the conventional sense. No fingerprint, no weapon, no overt threat. It was, instead, a revelation of psychology through action, habit disturbed, gestures inconsistent, rituals interrupted. Alleyn knew the significance. The clue lay not in the grand or the dramatic, but in the quiet insistence of routine, in the subtle fracture that only an attentive mind could discern. It would be enough, eventually, to illuminate motive and circumstance alike. And in that stillness, Alleyn's gaze returned to the two pianos, twin sentinels of ritual and tension, awaiting the next movement, not of music, but of human design. The evening settled into a fragile equilibrium, each guest resuming their constrained positions as if the earlier discovery of Maynard's death had been an interlude rather than a rupture. The air of civility remained intact, yet beneath it there was a tension almost tangible, like the silence before a chord resolves. Alleyn observed this with his customary patience, noting each flicker of unease, each gesture betraying thought or suspicion. It was Lady Helena who first drew attention to the next subtle disruption. She had been walking toward the refreshments when her hand paused upon a small folded envelope, half protruding from the pocket of her writing desk. She picked it up delicately, eyes narrowing. This is curious," she murmured, almost to herself, before glancing toward Alleyn. He crossed the room quietly, examining the envelope without touch. The handwriting was familiar, precise, deliberate, unmistakably Maynard's. He unfolded the note carefully, reading the lines with a composed, unhurried attention. It was brief, cryptic. "Livia knows more than she admits. Timing is everything. Watch for the smallest misstep." The words, innocuous yet pointed, caused a ripple through Alleyn's awareness. Maynard, meticulous to the point of ritualistic obsession, had left a warning, an insight into his perception of tension between himself and Livia Arden, or perhaps the tension she herself had fostered. The implications were quiet, yet undeniable. Someone in the room had been privy to motives or intentions that might otherwise remain hidden. Sir Julian, peering over Lady Helena's shoulder, coughed softly. "Remarkable," he murmured, tone measured, "how even in death one might cast a shadow over the living. Cryptic warnings, subtle suggestions. The dramatics of the departed, though unintentional, still influence our perception." Alleyn allowed a faint smile. "Perception is rarely untainted by circumstance, Sir Julian, and subtleties, often dismissed by the casual observer, can be instructive." Meanwhile, Sorel's posture had changed, imperceptibly but unmistakably. He had moved closer to his piano, as if to draw comfort from routine, yet his fingers traced the edge of the keys absently, betraying a preoccupation that even civility could not mask. Livia, who had remained at a careful distance, watched him with a vigilance that suggested calculation rather than mourning. Their shared glance, fleeting and almost imperceptible, was charged with unsaid understanding. The next stir of disturbance occurred more quietly, almost without notice. The young footman, who had maintained a discreet watch in the doorway, suddenly appeared pale and unsteady. He whispered to Greaves, who moved with measured precision to guide the boy to a seat and offer a glass of water. I fear I may have seen something," the youth murmured, voice barely audible above the subdued chatter. Alleyn approached, calm and deliberate. "And what might that be?" The footman's eyes flickered toward the far piano. "I thought I saw someone touch the keys, Inspector, but no one was there. I must be mistaken." Alleyn nodded, acknowledging the report without judgment. "Very well. We will keep it in mind." He knew that observations such as these, fragmented, uncertain, almost spectral, often carried meaning when interpreted in the context of habit and motive. Lady Helena, sensing the room's growing tension, attempted to restore normality. "Perhaps we might resume the rehearsal for those who still wish to hear it," she suggested. Yet even as she spoke, a delicate unease lingered. The music, once central to the gathering, now seemed secondary to the web of anxieties quietly entwining the room. Alleyn remained near the center, observing the interplay of glances, gestures, and controlled movements. Each ripple of behavior, each hesitation or subtle realignment of posture, contributed to a growing understanding that the evening's initial calamity had awakened other, quieter disturbances. Small cracks were appearing in the otherwise polished facade, evidence of pressure, rivalry, and hidden knowledge. The pianos, twin black monuments of ritual, remained untouched. And yet, in the eyes of those who circled them, in the angles of their gestures, and in the hesitant cadence of their speech, a new tension was taking shape, a second movement in a quiet drama that had no overt violence, no spectacle, but was no less precise or deliberate. Alleyn's mind catalogued each detail with meticulous care. The letter, the footman's uncertainty, the subtle shifts in posture and expression, all were notes in a composition more intricate than any musical score. And as he surveyed the room, he realized that the evening's quiet collapse had only begun, and that the next revelation would arrive not in grand gestures, but in whispers, omissions, and the smallest of missteps. Alleyn withdrew briefly to a windowed alcove overlooking the trimmed gardens of Hayford House. Outside, the evening had deepened into a navy stillness, broken only by the occasional reflection of the lamplight on wet leaves. Inside, the room remained poised between social propriety and the unspoken tremor of unease. He allowed himself a quiet exhalation, settling into observation not as an act of inquiry, but as a patient orchestration of perception. The pattern of behavior had begun to clarify, though the evidence was not one of paper or object, but of the human mind itself. Sorrel's tension, Livia's measured attentiveness, the servant's disciplined yet altered routines, all spoke of the subtle fractures revealed in pressure, rivalry, and fear. Alleyn's experience told him that truth, like sediment, always settled if one merely waited and watched. He observed Sorrel speaking softly to Lady Helena, the faint tremor in his fingers suggesting agitation beyond polite acknowledgement. Livia, across the room, was upright, still, yet her eyes, narrowed slightly, tracked every movement as if rehearsing not music, but strategy. The guest circle, meanwhile, maintained composure, yet the subtle adjustments of posture and glances betrayed an awareness of observation itself. Each motion, each hesitation, was a note in the quiet symphony of human interaction. Alleyn's attention returned to the two pianos, reflecting upon the small irregularities he had catalogued. The tilt of Maynard's music stand, the smudge on the bench, the unusual chord notation in the score, the cryptic note regarding timing. Each anomaly was minor alone. Yet together they formed a sequence, an intentional disruption, though by whom remained unclear. It was in such quiet manipulations of circumstance that human motive often revealed itself most distinctly. A soft cough drew his attention to Lady Helena. She approached with careful composure, yet there was a glint in her eyes that betrayed concern. "Inspector, you have been observing for some time," she remarked. "Have you discerned anything?" Alleyn's gaze met hers with gentle precision. "Observations, Lady Helena, are rarely complete until one considers the absences as carefully as the presence. Some truths reveal themselves not in declarations, but in what is withheld, gestures, omissions, habitual deviations. These are as instructive as words, often more so." He moved slowly back into the room, allowing his eyes to sweep over the assembled guests. Sorrel, still near the piano, had resumed his posture of restrained readiness. Livia, poised and alert, now interacted with Sir Julian. The critics' probing questions met with carefully neutral responses. Each person's conduct offered hints of hidden pressures. Each was performing within the bounds of etiquette, yet none were untouched by the evening's earlier disruption. Alleyn allowed his mind to trace the connections subtly forming. The cryptic letter, the adjustments in routine, the inconsistencies of gesture. These were not accidents. Maynard had sensed tension, and perhaps, in his final act, attempted to communicate a warning, however veiled. The smallest hints, the imperceptible shifts of habit, were now becoming a map of motive and opportunity. He paused near the window, allowing the quiet of the gardens to lend perspective. Outside, the branches swayed gently in a windless evening, and a single light flickered in the distance. Inside, the house remained impeccably ordered, yet the invisible architecture of human psychology had begun to reveal its subtle fractures. Alleyn's intuition, honed through years of observation and reflection, settled like dust over the scene, bringing with it the first outlines of understanding. It was not certainty, but a convergence of insight. Tension between the musicians, unspoken knowledge in the servants' eyes, the carefully veiled rivalries among guests, and the small, deliberate anomalies left in the music and the room. Each was a fragment. Together, they hinted at a hidden orchestration, a narrative unfolding quietly, intentionally, beneath the veneer of civility. Alleyn straightened, the calm of his presence seeming to radiate into the room. No declaration was necessary. No accusation was yet appropriate. Understanding, he knew, must be held in reserve until every gesture, every pause, and every whispered observation had been considered. The truth would emerge, not with noise, but with the subtle inevitability of pattern and consequence. And in that patient stillness, he allowed himself the faintest acknowledgement of progress. The pieces of the evening, like scattered notes in a complex score, were beginning to align. The guests had gradually begun to regain composure, speaking in muted tones, carefully navigating the social tightrope between curiosity and decorum. The pianos, twin sentinels of ritual and subtle tension, remained untouched, as if aware that the performance had long since concluded and the real drama had begun elsewhere. Alleyn moved quietly through the room, his presence calm yet commanding in its understated precision. He approached Sorel first, who had returned to his customary position near the center of the chamber. The musician's posture was rigid, fingers lightly brushing the piano keys, yet he made no effort to play. Alleyn inclined his head politely. "Mr. Sorel, may I have a word with you, alone?" Sorrel's pale eyes flicked toward Lady Helena, who had noticed the exchange, but said nothing. "Of course, Inspector," he replied, his voice carefully measured. He led the way to the small antechamber where Maynard had been found, the door closing behind them with the quiet finality of a curtain drawn. Alleyn regarded him calmly, noting the faint tremor in Sorel's hands, the subtle tightening of his jaw. "You were aware," Alleyn began softly, "that Mr. Maynard harbored concerns that might have involved you, or Miss Arden. Do you understand what I refer to?" Sorrel's gaze darted briefly to the piano, then back to Alleyn. I sensed tension," he admitted, carefully chosen words avoiding any admission of guilt. "But I cannot claim to understand the full measure of it. Livia, she is precise in everything. I did not anticipate." His voice trailed, leaving the thought suspended, fragile. Alleyn's eyes remained steady. "You noticed the deviations, the small fractures in routine, did you not? The misaligned stands, the altered gestures?" Sorel nodded, pale and still. "Yes. They troubled me, yes. But I thought it inconsequential. Music is full of anomalies. people even more so. Alleyn allowed a pause, letting the silence emphasize the weight of implication. And yet, sometimes anomalies are deliberate. Sometimes they speak when words cannot. And sometimes, he added quietly, they tell us what the deceased wished to reveal. Sorrel swallowed. I understand, Inspector. I only wish I had perceived it sooner. Alleyn inclined his head as if accepting the statement without judgment. Perception is a skill that matures with patience. You have observed much tonight, and now the question is what actions were taken or left unspoken before the final moment. After a measured silence, Alleyn left Sorel in the antechamber, returning to the main room with the air of someone who had glimpsed something significant yet would not yet disclose it. He allowed the guests to remain calm, their polite murmurs resuming as if guided by an invisible hand. The subtle equilibrium of the evening had been restored, yet a quiet tension lingered, unnoticed by most, but palpable to those attuned to observation. Livia, sensing his scrutiny, approached with careful composure. "Inspector, do you intend to question everyone further?" she asked, voice smooth, neutral, yet layered with controlled curiosity. "I prefer," Alleyn replied, "to allow the room and its occupants to reveal themselves naturally. A gesture, a hesitation, a choice of words or of silence can be more instructive than any direct inquiry." Her eyes flickered briefly toward the pianos, then returned to him. "You observe much," she said lightly, almost as if acknowledging a truth she had long suspected. "Observation," Alleyn said softly, "is the beginning of understanding. The rest, as always, requires patience." The guests, unaware of the quiet exchanges that had transpired, continued to converse in measured tones. Alleyn remained at the periphery, collecting the impressions, the small shifts of tension, the subtle orchestration of behavior. Each fragment was a note in a composition of human action, each gesture a clue to motive, each silence a declaration of restraint. In the hush of the room, Alleyn recognized the inevitability of revelation, not a dramatic unveiling, but a quiet, inexorable settling of truths. The performers, the guests, the servants, all had left traces of intention, no matter how delicately concealed. And when the time came, the culmination would be neither explosive nor theatrical, but precise, elegant, and inevitable. For now, he allowed the calm to persist, trusting the rhythm of human behavior to carry the story forward until the final note could be understood. The room was hushed once more, though the subdued murmur of the guests persisted, like the faint echo of music after the final chord has been struck. Alleyn moved quietly to the center, his presence calm, deliberate, commanding without force. He gestured lightly to the two pianos, which gleamed in the soft lamplight, their polished surfaces reflecting the gathered company with an unyielding clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice measured, almost conversational, "we have spent this evening observing, listening, and allowing the small tensions of habit and circumstance to reveal themselves. Often, truth resides not in dramatic declarations, but in the quiet fractures of routine, in gestures overlooked, in silences maintained." A pause settled over the room. The guests straightened imperceptibly, attuned to the rhythm of his words, sensing a culmination, yet unannounced. Alleyn's eyes, calm and unwavering, swept over each person, noting posture, micro-expressions, the briefest flicker of acknowledgement or tension. "It has become clear," he continued softly, "that Mr. Maynard's final warning was not an accident of phrasing or handwriting. It was a reflection of insight, an insight into the delicate web of relationships, rivalries, and loyalties in this room, and indeed into actions that disrupted the natural course of routine." He turned slightly, his gaze settling on Livia Arden. Her posture remained controlled, her eyes clear yet alert. Alleyn's voice remained calm, almost intimate. "Miss Arden, your attention to detail is remarkable, as is your precision in both music and conduct. Yet it is precisely that precision, when applied to circumstances beyond your control, that allowed subtle tension to escalate, unnoticed by most, yet recorded in the habits and routines that others observed." She did not flinch, though her fingers lightly brushed the edge of the piano bench. "Inspector," she said evenly, "I'm afraid I do not understand." Alleyn inclined his head slightly, a hint of gentle persuasion in his tone. Mr. Maynard, meticulous and careful, observed deviations, gestures and habits that were not in his own control, nor in yours. Yet they were interpreted, misinterpreted, or amplified, by intent or by circumstance. The message he left, the deviations he noted, and the habits that remained unchanged, all form a map of responsibility, subtle but inescapable. He paused, allowing the weight of the observation to settle. The guests listened attentively, some frowning, some silent, all drawn into the unfolding cadence of deduction. Alleyn's attention shifted subtly to Sorrel, who now stood straighter, yet paler, aware that the gentle precision of the evening's revelations had begun to draw a net around understanding. "The truth, then," Alleyn said softly, "is not one of dramatics or spectacle. It is quiet, inevitable, and undeniable. The disruption of Mr. Maynard's routine, the small deviations, the carefully maintained silences, and the subtle gestures all point to an orchestration within this room, one that required the intervention of observation, patience, and understanding to discern." He allowed a final pause, letting his words sink. "And the individual responsible is aware of both action and consequence. No shouting, no confrontation, no spectacle is required. Only acknowledgement, only recognition of the patterns that have been present from the beginning." Livia's hands rested lightly on the piano, her expression calm, yet her eyes flickered slightly, an imperceptible acknowledgement of comprehension. Sorrel exhaled faintly, his tension easing but leaving behind a residue of unease. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, balanced delicately between civility and the recognition of truth. Alleyn's voice softened further, almost conversational now. "Let it be understood that justice in this house is often as quiet as music and as inevitable as the patterns that compose it. The truth does not scream. It settles softly into the consciousness of those who observe and those who act." The guests, aware that the moment of revelation had passed, resumed their positions, some lowering into chairs, others observing the twin pianos as though the instruments themselves had absorbed the lesson. Alleyn stepped back, eyes sweeping the room with calm satisfaction. The evening's disruptions, the subtle fractures, the quiet tensions, all had been recognized, acknowledged, and understood. And in that soft, imperceptible acknowledgement, the story of Highford House and the code of the two pianos reached its quiet, inevitable resolution. The guests had departed at last, leaving Highford House in a silence that was at once both formal and intimate. The pianos, twin monuments of ritual and tension, gleamed in the soft lamplight, their polished surfaces reflecting the calm of the room. The evening's revelations, subtle as they had been, had settled into the consciousness of those who remained. Only Alleyn and Lady Helena lingered, the faint aroma of polished wood and waxed floors lingering in the air. Alleyn moved slowly through the room, observing the minor imperfections that had once suggested disruption. Now, each smudge, each tilt, each small deviation of routine seemed less ominous and more like a testament to human intricacy, a record of choices, fears, and intentions. He paused beside the piano that had been central to so many of the night's observations, his fingers lightly brushing. The keys. The notes, though silent, carried echoes of tension, loyalty, rivalry, and unspoken truths. Lady Helena approached quietly. "Inspector," she said, voice low. It seems all is concluded, and yet there is a stillness I cannot fully comprehend. Will there be justice? Alleyn regarded her with his usual calm, a hint of gentle gravity in his gaze. Justice, he said softly, is not always the dramatic confrontation one imagines. It is often quiet, inevitable, and contained within the consequences of choice. In this house, as elsewhere, the truth has emerged, not with shouting, but with recognition. The individual responsible will carry that knowledge, just as the room carries its own subtle memory of the events that transpired. He allowed a measured pause, eyes sweeping the empty seats and polished surfaces, cataloguing the invisible traces of human behavior. Patterns persist, Lady Helena. Habits, gestures, silences. They leave impressions far longer than words or declarations. The weight of awareness, of understanding one's own role in events, is often a greater restraint than any external punishment. She nodded slowly, absorbing the insight with the careful thought for which she was known. So, life resumes? She asked. In form, yes. In substance, nothing is quite the same, Alleyn replied, voice gentle. The pianos remain. The music, literal and figurative, will continue. Yet those who inhabit this space will carry the quiet resonance of what occurred here. The fractures in habit, the deviations in routine, the unspoken intentions. They remain as reminders and lessons, subtle and enduring. He stepped to the window, looking out toward the darkened gardens, where shadows traced the outlines of meticulously trimmed hedges. The wind stirred a solitary branch, its motion mirrored faintly in the polished floors within. Alleyn's gaze softened, a flicker of reflective thought passing behind his composed exterior. Human behavior, he murmured, is far more revealing than any instrument of justice. It is in the smallest acts, the quietest gestures, the decisions made or withheld, that the truth resides. The world, after all, is full of music, some discordant, some harmonious, but always present to those who care to observe. Lady Helena's eyes followed his, thoughtful and serene. And those who observe most carefully, Inspector. They carry understanding, Alleyn said simply, a faint smile touching his lips. And in understanding they find both clarity and restraint. That, perhaps, is the most enduring justice of all. With that, he allowed the room to fall into its gentle silence. Outside, the night deepened, indifferent yet reflective, as if the world itself acknowledged the resolution within the walls of Hayford House. And within that quiet, Alleyn's calm presence, patient and perceptive, remained the last witness to a subtle orchestration of human intention, leaving the house and its inhabitants forever altered, yet undisturbed in appearance. The pianos stood as they always had, black, polished, silent, guardians of routine, reminders of habit, and witnesses to the delicate, inexorable rhythms of truth.